Hello and welcome to History by the Fireside. In today's episode, we delve into the birth of the United States. Most people think this story begins with a single famous declaration. But that is not the whole picture. The real story is a messy saga of ambition and transformation, forged over nearly 2 centuries. The central question is simple. How did 13 colonies unite against a superpower? This was a grand experiment forged in brutal conflict and radical ideas. We will explore the lesser-known stories that truly shaped a nation. Let's begin with today's story. The American story doesn't begin with heroes seeking freedom. It starts with a get-rich-quick scheme. In 1607, 3 small ships carrying about 100 men and boys arrived in Virginia. They were employees of the Virginia Company, a private firm in London. Their mission was simple: find gold, find a river route to Asia, and don't die. They failed spectacularly at 2 of those things. They settled in a swampy, mosquito-infested peninsula they named Jamestown, a terrible choice for a home. The water was brackish, the land difficult to farm, and disease spread quickly. Worse, many of the colonists were gentlemen who considered manual labor beneath them. They expected to find gold nuggets lying on the ground. Instead, they found mud and hunger. Their survival depended entirely on the local Powhatan Confederacy. This powerful group of tribes was led by a shrewd chief. The colonists' leader, a tough mercenary named John Smith, understood the situation. He forced the gentlemen to work, famously declaring, "He that will not work shall not eat." He also negotiated for food with the Powhatan, which brings us to the famous story of Pocahontas. Forget the Disney romance. Pocahontas, the chief's daughter, was a key diplomat. Her interactions with Smith were likely political theater, a ceremony to adopt him and his starving colonists into the Powhatan's world. But this fragile peace didn't last. After Smith was injured and returned to England, things fell apart. The winter of 1609 became known as the Starving Time. With no strong leader and poor relations with the natives, the colonists were trapped inside their fort. They ate their horses, then dogs, cats, rats, and even leather from their shoes. By spring, the vast majority of them had perished. The colony was functionally dead. The few survivors were literally abandoning the settlement when a supply ship appeared, and with it came a man named John Rolfe. He brought a new, sweeter strain of tobacco from the Caribbean. This plant became Virginia's gold. It was highly addictive and hugely popular in Europe. Jamestown was saved, not by noble ideals, but by a cash crop. The foundation of the first English colony was built on smoke, desperation, and a very narrow escape from total disaster. While Virginians chased profits from tobacco, a different kind of English settler headed north. These were not adventurers seeking gold. They were families, Puritans, fleeing what they saw as the corruption of the Church of England. Their leader was a lawyer named John Winthrop. Aboard their ship in 1630, he delivered a famous sermon. He told his followers they would be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of the world were upon them. This was not a mission to create a land of liberty for all. It was an experiment to build a perfect society for God. This society was based on a sacred contract or covenant. The people promised to live by God's laws, and God promised to bless them. This idea shaped everything. Government and religion were fused. Life was orderly, built on family farms and maritime trade. But it was also intensely rigid. Your neighbors were not just neighbors, they were moral watchdogs. The system had zero tolerance for dissent. Just ask Roger Williams. He preached that the government should have no say in religious matters. For this radical idea, he was banished. He walked south and founded Rhode Island, a colony built on genuine religious freedom. Then came Anne Hutchinson, a sharp-witted woman who challenged the minister's authority. She too was kicked out. This demand for absolute conformity eventually reached a terrifying extreme. The Salem witch trials of 1692 were a moment of mass hysteria. A culture of fear and suspicion exploded, leading to accusations and executions. It was the darkest consequence of a society that left no room for doubt. So, the New England colonies were forged from a powerful, if intolerant, vision. They sought freedom for themselves, but certainly not for others. This experiment would leave a deep, lasting mark on the American identity. It introduced a sense of moral purpose and destiny. This was a stark contrast to the world being built down south. Between the zealous Puritans of the North and the tobacco barons of the South, a third kind of America was taking shape. These were the middle colonies. They were not founded on a single grand vision. They were a practical, messy, and incredibly diverse collection of people just trying to make a living. New York is the perfect case study. It did not even begin as an English colony. It was New Amsterdam, a Dutch trading post run with a singular focus on business. From its earliest days, it was a bustling port, where your ability to turn a profit was far more important than your religious beliefs. This pragmatic attitude was perfectly clear in 1664. English warships sailed into the harbor and demanded the colony's surrender. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, a famously stubborn man with a wooden leg, wanted to fight. The city's merchants, however, saw things differently. A battle would be absolutely terrible for trade. They convinced him to stand down, and the colony changed hands without a single cannonball being fired. Further south, Pennsylvania was born from a far more idealistic vision. It was the brainchild of William Penn, a prominent Quaker. Quakers were a radical group for their time. They were pacifists who believed in total religious equality for everyone. Penn dreamed of a holy experiment, a safe haven where people of all faiths could live together in peace. He put his principles into practice. He famously signed a treaty with the local Lenape tribes, paying them for their land instead of taking it by force. This policy of respect was almost unheard of. It attracted a wave of immigrants from across Europe. Germans, Scots, Irish, and others flocked to Pennsylvania for its promise of freedom and farmland. This combination of rich soil and a diverse population turned the region into the breadbasket of the colonies. They grew vast amounts of wheat and grain, feeding other colonies and fueling the growth of port cities like Philadelphia. The middle colonies were not a shining city on a hill or a gamble for gold. They were the original American melting pot, where tolerance was not just an ideal, but a simple necessity for building a life. Down south, the model established in Virginia became supercharged. While the North built ships and the middle colonies grew wheat, the Southern economy was an engine built for one purpose. It was designed to generate immense wealth from cash crops. It started with tobacco but soon expanded. In the swampy lowlands of the Carolinas, planters discovered gold mines in rice and indigo, a plant that produced a valuable blue dye. This system required a massive and reliable source of labor. At first, planters relied on indentured servants from England. These were poor workers who traded several years of their labor for passage to America. But they were a temporary solution. Once their term was up, they were free, and they wanted their own land. For the planter elite, this was an inconvenient and unstable system. They needed a permanent workforce they could completely control. They found their solution in a system of permanent hereditary bondage. The first Africans had arrived in Virginia in 1619. Their initial status was often complex, sometimes similar to that of indentured servants. Over the following decades, however, a sinister legal transformation took place. Colonial assemblies passed laws that became known as slave codes. These laws systematically stripped away all rights from Africans and their children. They made slavery a permanent condition, passed from mother to child, and based entirely on race. This created a society unlike any other in the colonies. A tiny aristocracy of fantastically wealthy planters sat at the top. They controlled the best land, the government, and the lives of thousands of enslaved people. Their refined lifestyle was built directly on the brutal, back-breaking labor of others. Within this horrific system, a vibrant and resilient culture was born. Enslaved people blended African traditions with American realities. They created unique forms of music, religion, and community that sustained them through unimaginable hardship. They also resisted. Resistance took many forms, from the quiet defiance of slowing down work and breaking tools to more desperate acts of outright rebellion. This was the great, glaring contradiction at the heart of the South. A society obsessed with its own liberty, built entirely upon the absolute denial of liberty to others. For much of the early 18th century, Britain ran its American colonies like an absent landlord. London was busy with its own European wars and political dramas. As long as the rent checks, in the form of raw materials, kept coming in, nobody bothered to inspect the property too closely. This policy had a formal name: salutary neglect. The idea was the brainchild of Prime Minister Robert Walpole. His philosophy was simple. If the colonies were making money and not causing trouble, it was best to just leave them alone. Officially, strict laws like the Navigation Acts were in place. These laws required the colonies to trade only with England. In reality, colonial merchants treated these acts as a gentle suggestion. A ship captain in Boston or Philadelphia could make a killing smuggling cheap French sugar or Spanish molasses. This was not seen as an act of rebellion. It was just smart business. This widespread illegal trade made the colonies incredibly prosperous and created a powerful merchant class accustomed to bending the rules. This economic independence bled directly into politics. Since the royal governors were an entire ocean away from their bosses, real power drifted into the hands of local assemblies. Institutions like the Virginia House of Burgesses or New England's town meetings were not just for debate. They passed local laws, and most importantly, they controlled the money. They held what was called the power of the purse. This meant they paid the governor's salary. If a governor tried to enforce an unpopular British policy, he might find his paycheck conveniently delayed for months. It was a brilliantly simple form of leverage. This taught the colonists a crucial lesson in self-government. For decades, they were British subjects in name, but Americans in practice. They built their own societies and ran their own affairs with little to no interference. An entire generation grew up thinking this was normal. But this entire system depended on one thing: London not paying attention what would happen when the landlord finally decided to show up. The long period of British distraction was about to end. The reason was simple: competition. France also had its eyes on North America, specifically the vast, fertile Ohio River Valley. This territory was the gateway to the entire continent, and neither empire was willing to share. In 1754, Virginia's governor sent a young militia officer to deliver an eviction notice to the French. His name was George Washington. The mission was a complete failure. On a second attempt, Washington's men ambushed a French patrol, which sparked a much larger conflict. He was soon trapped and forced to surrender at a makeshift fort he called Fort Necessity. It was a deeply humiliating start to his military career. This was no small colonial dispute. It was the American theater of the 7 Years' War, a global struggle for imperial dominance. The first few years were a catastrophe for the British. Their soldiers marched in disciplined lines, a terrible strategy in the dense American forests. They became easy targets for the French and their Native American allies, who were masters of guerrilla warfare. Britain's victory required a change in strategy. and immense resources. They secured a vital alliance with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. The decisive moment finally came in 1759. British forces achieved a stunning surprise attack, scaling the cliffs to capture the fortress city of Quebec. This victory effectively broke French power in North America. The war concluded with the Treaty of Paris. The terms were a geopolitical earthquake. France surrendered Canada and all its lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The British Empire now stood as the undisputed master of the continent. But this victory was incredibly expensive. London was now buried under a mountain of debt, and Parliament had a very clear idea about who should help pay it off. From London's perspective, the bill for that victory had arrived. It was astronomical. Britain's national debt had ballooned to over £132 million. The interest payments alone were consuming more than half of the entire national budget. Someone had to pay for this. To the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, the answer was obvious. He was less of a grand strategist and more of a meticulous accountant. Looking at the books, he saw one group that had benefited immensely from the war. That group was the American colonists. Grenville's logic was simple. The war had been fought to protect the colonies from the French. Now, a permanent army of 10,000 British soldiers would be stationed in North America to defend the new frontier. To Parliament, it was only fair that the colonists help shoulder this financial burden. This was not tyranny in their eyes. It was simple accounting. The long, comfortable era of salutary neglect was officially over. The first move was not a tax, but a boundary. The Proclamation of 1763 drew a line straight down the Appalachian Mountains. It forbade any colonial settlement to the west of that line. This was meant to be a practical measure. The goal was to avoid costly conflicts with Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley. But to land-hungry colonists, it was a direct insult. It felt like the king was caging them, just as they had won the freedom to expand. This was only the beginning. Grenville's government began to search for new ways to squeeze revenue out of America. The goal was no longer just to regulate trade for the empire's benefit. The new goal was to raise money directly from colonial pockets. This money would pay for colonial administration and defense. The parent had not just started paying attention, he was sending a bill. The celebrations after the Stamp Act repeal were short-lived. The fundamental problem had not gone away. Britain was still deeply in debt, and Parliament, thanks to the Declaratory Act, still believed it was the absolute boss. The calm lasted about a year. Then a new man took charge of the British Treasury. His name was Charles Townshend, a witty and dangerously arrogant politician. He listened to the colonial complaints and thought he found a clever loophole. He believed the colonists would accept external taxes, which were duties on imported goods. So, in 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These laws placed a new tax on several imported goods. The list included glass, lead, paint, and paper. The most famous tax, of course, was on tea. From London's perspective, this was simply regulating trade. But Townshend added a sinister twist. The money raised would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in America. This was a direct attack on the colony's cherished power of the purse. The colonists were not fooled for a second. This time the response came not from mobs, but from a pen. A lawyer named John Dickinson wrote a series of popular essays. They were called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson argued that the purpose of a tax was what mattered most. A tax designed to raise money was still taxation without representation. It did not matter if it was internal or external. The boycotts started all over again. Merchants signed agreements not to import British goods. But this time, The resistance had a powerful new engine: colonial women. Groups calling themselves the Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees. They made their own homespun cloth instead of buying British textiles. It became a patriotic statement to serve coffee or herbal infusions instead of taxed British tea. To enforce these unpopular laws, Britain sent a new board of customs officials to Boston. When Bostonians resisted, London's response was decisive. In 1768, warships sailed into Boston Harbor, carrying regiments of British soldiers. The city was now under military occupation, setting the stage for a much bloodier confrontation. Boston felt like a city under siege. The presence of British soldiers was a constant source of friction. They were not just an occupying army. They were competitors for scarce jobs, and their red coats were a daily reminder of London's authority. The tension was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on a freezing night, March 5th, 1770. It started with taunts and snowballs thrown at a lone British sentry. A crowd gathered. Bells began to ring, drawing more people into the streets. Amid the chaos and shouting, someone fired a shot. Then came more shots, a volley into the confused mob. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the snow. The Patriots' propaganda machine went into overdrive. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty immediately branded the event the Boston Massacre. A silversmith named Paul Revere created an engraving that became the most famous image of the event. His picture was not journalism. It was a masterpiece of political marketing. It showed British soldiers firing on a peaceful, unarmed crowd, erasing the reality of a chaotic street brawl. But then came a surprising twist. The British soldiers were arrested and put on trial for murder. Finding a lawyer to defend them seemed impossible. The answer shocked everyone. John Adams, a leading patriot and cousin of Samuel Adams, took the case. He did it to prove a core principle. He wanted to show that the colonies stood for justice and the rule of law, not mob vengeance. His defense was remarkably successful, leading to acquittals for the captain and most of his men. Adams had proven his point about colonial justice. But in the court of public opinion, the facts no longer mattered. Revere's powerful image had done its work. The story of a bloody massacre was now set in stone. After the trial of the soldiers, a tense and deceptive calm settled over the colonies. London, hoping to lower the temperature, repealed most of the townshend taxes, but they left one in place. The small duty on tea was a stubborn reminder of Parliament's power, a symbolic line in the sand. Then, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This law was not designed to punish the colonies at all. It was actually a corporate bailout. The massive British East India Company was nearly bankrupt, its warehouses overflowing with unsold tea. The act gave the company a monopoly. This allowed it to sell its tea directly in America, cutting out colonial merchants. Here was the clever part. Even with the tax, this official tea would be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea most colonists drank. Parliament thought this was a brilliant move. They assumed American colonists were fundamentally cheap. They believed the colonists would happily pay a tiny tax to get a bargain. They had completely misread the room. To the Patriots, this was a Trojan horse. It was a trick designed to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. The price was irrelevant. The principle was everything. When the tea ships arrived in Boston Harbor, the Sons of Liberty refused to let them unload their cargo. The breaking point came on the night of December 16, 1773. After a fiery public meeting, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians marched to the docks. With quiet efficiency, they boarded 3 ships. Over the next 3 hours, they systematically smashed open 342 chests of tea. They dumped every last leaf into the cold harbor water. The value of the destroyed property was immense. It was estimated at well over $1.7 million in today's money. While some patriots celebrated this bold act, others were horrified. Even Benjamin Franklin condemned the destruction of private property. But in London, the reaction was pure, undiluted rage. This was no longer seen as a protest. This was rebellion. The reaction in London was not just anger. It was a cold, calculated fury. Parliament believed Boston was a nest of radicals that had to be crushed as an example to the other colonies. The time for warnings was over. The time for punishment had arrived. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that were so harsh, the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. They were designed to break Massachusetts completely. The first was the Boston Port Act. It was simple and brutal. The harbor was closed to all trade. The city's economic lifeblood was cut off until every last bit of the destroyed tea was paid for. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act. This was a political execution. It effectively canceled the colony's charter. The upper house of the legislature would now be appointed by the king, not elected. Town meetings, the very heart of local democracy, were severely restricted. The colonists' power over their own government was simply erased. Then came the Administration of Justice Act. This law allowed any royal official accused of a capital crime in Massachusetts to be sent to Britain for trial. The colonists called it the Murder Act. They believed it gave British soldiers a free pass to harass and even kill colonists without fear of local justice. As if that were not enough, another law, the Quebec Act, was passed at the same time. It expanded the southern border of Canada into lands the colonists coveted. It also granted religious freedom to Catholics, which deeply alarmed the Protestant majority in the colonies. To them, it looked like another piece of the same tyrannical puzzle. Parliament's goal was to make an example of Massachusetts, but they achieved the exact opposite. Instead of being isolated, Boston became a martyr. Food and supplies poured in from other colonies. A farmer in Virginia realized that if the king could dissolve Massachusetts' assembly, he could dissolve Virginia's next. The punishment had backfired, uniting the colonies in shared fear and outrage. In Boston, General Thomas Gage, the new military governor, knew the colony was a powder keg. He learned that rebels were stockpiling gunpowder and cannons in the town of Concord. His plan seemed simple. A swift, secret night march to seize the supplies before the colonists could react. But the Patriots had spies everywhere. As 700 British troops began their march on the night of April 18, 1775, so did the riders. Paul Revere and William Dawes galloped through the darkness, shouting the alarm. They were later joined by another rider named Samuel Prescott, who carried the warning all the way to Concord. At sunrise in Lexington, the British advance guard met about 70 colonial militiamen waiting on the village green. A British officer yelled for them to disperse. In the tense standoff, a shot rang out. No one knows for sure who fired it. But when the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. These were the first casualties of the war. The British marched on to Concord, only to find the arsenal was mostly empty. At the town's North Bridge, however, the story changed completely. Hundreds of militiamen had gathered. This time, when the British fired, the colonists fired back, forcing the Redcoats into a full retreat. That 16-mile march back to Boston became a nightmare for the world's finest army. Thousands of militiamen swarmed the road. They fired from behind every tree, stone wall, and farmhouse. It was a brutal running battle, a humiliating rout. By the time the exhausted survivors stumbled back into Boston, nearly 300 of their comrades were killed or wounded. General Gage's police action had failed spectacularly. What began as a mission to seize weapons had become a war. His army was now trapped in Boston, surrounded by thousands of angry colonists. A war had started, but the goal remained surprisingly unclear. Most colonists were still fighting for their rights as Englishmen. They hoped for some kind of reconciliation with the king. The idea of a complete break was still too radical for many. Then, in January 1776, a man named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet. It was called Common Sense, and it spread like wildfire. Paine was a recent immigrant, and he wrote in plain, fiery language that everyone could understand. His message was revolutionary. He argued that monarchy was an absurd and outdated institution, calling King George a royal brute. Most importantly, Paine declared it was America's destiny to be an independent continent. The pamphlet sold as many as 500,000 copies, completely changing the public conversation in every tavern and town square. This wave of public opinion crashed into the Second Continental Congress. The delegates meeting in Philadelphia were now pushed towards a final break. They appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal statement explaining their position to the world. The main author was a tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. The committee chose him for his elegant and powerful writing. Jefferson did not invent new ideas. Instead, he brilliantly summarized the spirit of the age, drawing on the Enlightenment philosophy of thinkers like John Locke. The document he wrote was more than just a list of complaints. It was a declaration of principles. It was a breakup letter to the king, arguing that governments get their power from the people, not from God. On July 4, 1776, the Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. This was the point of no return. The war was no longer about taxes or representation. It was now a fight for the creation of a new nation. This nation was founded on the radical idea that all people had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaring independence was one thing. Winning a war against the world's greatest military was something else entirely. The new Continental Army was a collection of farmers and merchants, poorly trained and prone to simply going home. The man Congress chose to lead this mess was a wealthy Virginia planter who had not commanded troops in nearly 2 decades. George Washington was not a brilliant battlefield tactician. In fact, he lost more battles than he won. His true genius was in survival. In 1776, the British arrived in New York with a massive fleet and army. Washington was completely outmaneuvered, and his forces were nearly trapped. A decisive defeat seemed certain. A lesser general would have surrendered, ending the war right there. Instead, he executed a masterful retreat under the cover of darkness and fog, saving his army to fight another day. By the end of the year, the revolution seemed over. The army was exhausted, defeated, and shrinking daily as enlistments expired. Washington knew he needed a miracle to restore hope. He planned a desperate gamble. On a freezing Christmas night, he led his men across the treacherous ice-choked Delaware River. They then marched for miles through a blizzard. Their surprise attack on a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton was a stunning success. The victory was small, but its impact was enormous. It was a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart of the cause. Washington's greatest test, however, was not a battle. It was the brutal winter his army endured at Valley Forge. His soldiers were starving and ravaged by disease in their makeshift camp. Up to 2,500 soldiers died without a single shot being fired. Morale collapsed under the horrific conditions, and the army was on the verge of disintegration. Washington's leadership during this time was monumental. He shared his men's hardships and lobbied Congress relentlessly for supplies. He simply refused to let the cause die. He understood that as long as this army existed, the revolution lived. He was the one indispensable man holding it all together. While Washington struggled to simply keep his army from dissolving, a different kind of war was unfolding in the North. The British had a grand, seemingly brilliant plan for 1777. General John Burgoyne, a man nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, would lead a massive army south from Canada. Two other British forces would advance from the west and north from New York City. The goal was to meet at Albany, cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies and strangling the rebellion. It was a beautiful plan on paper. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. The other two British commanders essentially failed to show up. One got distracted capturing Philadelphia, and the other was stopped by American militia. Gentleman Johnny was left all alone, dragging a massive supply train through the dense New York wilderness. American forces made his life miserable. They chopped down trees to block his path, destroyed bridges, and constantly harassed his troops. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga, his army was exhausted and running low on food. He was facing a growing American army under the command of General Horatio Gates. In two brutal battles, the Americans, led by the aggressive and brilliant Benedict Arnold, completely surrounded the British force. Burgoyne had no choice. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. This was not a small victory. It was a catastrophe for the British. The news of this stunning success raced across the Atlantic. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin had been trying for years to convince the French to officially join the war. The surrender at Saratoga was the proof he needed. It showed the world that the American rebels could actually win. France signed a formal treaty of alliance with the United States. The American Revolution was no longer just a colonial uprising. It was now a global war. With the war in the north a bloody stalemate, the British looked south. They launched a new southern strategy, convinced that a silent majority of loyalists were just waiting to rally to the king. For a time, it seemed to be working. Their commander, Lord Cornwallis, grew confident. He pushed his army deep into Virginia, eventually setting up a fortified base at a small port town called Yorktown. He chose it because he expected the powerful Royal Navy to be able to resupply him by sea. This turned out to be one of the worst assumptions in military history. Hundreds of miles away, George Washington saw his chance. He and his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, devised a brilliant and audacious plan. They would secretly march their combined armies south to trap Cornwallis. To keep the British from figuring it out, Washington staged an elaborate fake. He built huge camps and made it look like he was preparing to attack New York City. But the entire gamble depended on perfect timing and the French Navy. Everything rested on Admiral de Grasse arriving in the Chesapeake Bay at the exact right moment. He did. His powerful fleet engaged and defeated the British ships sent to relieve Cornwallis. The bay was sealed completely, and the trap was sprung. Cornwallis was now surrounded. On land, the massive Allied armies began a relentless siege. They pounded the British defenses with cannon fire. By sea, there was no escape. Cut off and overwhelmed, Cornwallis had no choice. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army of 8,000 soldiers. As the defeated Redcoats marched out to lay down their arms, tradition holds their bands played a tune. It was called "The World Turned Upside Down." This stunning victory was the knockout blow that broke Britain's will to continue the fight. The world had indeed turned upside down. But after the victory parades ended, the Americans faced a terrifying new reality. They had overthrown a government, but now they had to build one. Their first attempt, ratified in 1781, was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was a spectacular failure. The states were deeply suspicious of any strong central power. After all, they had just fought a war against a king. So they created a government that was less a government and more a committee that could only ask nicely. The National Congress could declare war and sign treaties, but it could not levy taxes. It could not raise a national army. It could not even regulate trade between the states. The results were disastrous. The government was broke. It could not pay back its massive war debts to France or its own citizens. Worse, it could not pay the soldiers who had actually won the war. These men were sent home with worthless paper promises. Meanwhile, the states began to act like 13 tiny, bickering countries. New York put a tax on firewood from Connecticut. New Jersey taxed a lighthouse owned by New York. It was economic chaos. The breaking point came in western Massachusetts in 1786. Farmers, many of them war veterans, were being crushed by debt and high state taxes. Their farms were being seized. Led by a former army captain named Daniel Shays, they took up their muskets again. This time, they marched on the courts to shut them down. This was Shays' rebellion, and the national government was completely powerless to stop it. There was no army to send. A privately funded militia had to be raised to put the rebellion down. This terrified the country's leaders. The revolution, it seemed, was about to devour itself. The grand experiment in liberty was teetering on the edge of anarchy. Something had to be done. That something happened in Philadelphia during the brutally hot summer of 1787. Delegates from 12 states gathered with the official modest goal of simply revising the Articles of Confederation to ensure they could speak freely. The windows of their meeting hall were nailed shut. They wanted total secrecy, away from the press and public pressure. Inside that stuffy room, they quickly realized that fixing the articles was impossible, so they made a radical decision. They would throw the entire system out and start from scratch. They were not there to amend a government. They were there to create one. A young Virginian named James Madison took on the role of unofficial scribe. He sat near the front, secretly taking detailed notes that became our only window into these historic debates. Almost immediately, the convention nearly broke apart. The central fight was about power. The big states, like Virginia, rolled out a plan. They argued that representation in the new government should be based on population. It seemed logical. More people should mean more power. But the small states, like New Jersey, panicked. They saw a future where a few large states would dominate everything. So they offered their own plan. They wanted equal representation for every state, regardless of its size. This was the fundamental question: was this a nation of people or a league of states? The arguments grew heated, and for weeks, they were completely deadlocked. Every issue was tangled in this one central conflict. This included everything from the power of the president to the right to tax. The entire American experiment, saved on the battlefield, now risked collapsing in a hot, airless room in Philadelphia. The solution that saved the convention came in the form of a deal. It was called the Great Compromise. The delegates created a two-house legislature, a clever way to give both sides what they wanted. One house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population. This made the big states happy. The other house, the Senate, would give every state 2 votes, no matter its size. This saved the small states from being ignored. But solving one problem immediately created another, much uglier one. It raised the thorny issue of how to count enslaved people for representation. Southern delegates demanded they be counted fully. This would give their states more political power. Northern delegates were horrified, arguing that people treated as property should not be counted at all. The result was the infamous 3/5 compromise. In a cold political calculation, the delegates agreed that each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a free person. This cynical bargain was written directly into the nation's founding document. It embedded the institution of slavery into the very structure of the new government. The deal-making did not stop there. The South agreed to let the new government regulate commerce, a key demand from the North. In exchange, the North agreed that the government could not ban the international slave trade for at least 20 years. Even the presidency was a compromise. Some wanted Congress to elect the president, while others wanted a direct popular vote. They settled on a strange, complicated system that pleased no one completely. The Electoral College. The document that emerged from that hot room was not a work of pure philosophy. It was a bundle of practical, messy, and sometimes monstrous compromises. It was a blueprint for a government, designed not for perfection, but for survival. When the founders walked out of that hot Philadelphia room in 1787, they had not built a finished nation. Anyone who tells you that is selling you a fairy tale. What they created was something far more radical and, in many ways, more interesting. They built a machine for arguing. It was a framework designed for permanent debate. They did not solve the biggest questions facing the new country. Instead, they gave future generations a rulebook for how to fight about them. The entire structure was a balancing act between competing fears and ambitions. It balanced the fear of a king against the fear of the mob. It balanced the ambition of large states against the survival of small ones. This blueprint for a government was a masterpiece of political engineering, but it was also deeply, tragically flawed. The founders knew this. The most profound and damaging argument was baked in from the start. It was written in the cold logic of terrible compromises over slavery. They created a republic dedicated to liberty, while protecting an institution that denied it. This was not just a blind spot. It was a foundational crack that would nearly shatter the entire structure in a brutal civil war. The promise of liberty was also hollow for others. The new nation's expansion came at the direct expense of Native American peoples. They were systematically dispossessed of their lands. Women, who played a vital role in the revolution, were denied a political voice. This is the dual legacy we inherit. The story of the nation's birth is not a simple tale of heroes in powdered wigs. It is the story of brilliant, flawed people trying to do something that had never been done before. They launched a grand experiment, but they left much of the work unfinished. The arguments we have today are not new. They are echoes from that room. Debates about the power of the central government and the rights of states continue. The question of who truly gets to be counted as we the people is still being argued. The founders did not give us the answers. They just gave us the arena. Thank you for joining us on this journey, from the muddy banks of Jamestown to the argumentative room in Philadelphia. We hope this exploration has shown that the birth of the United States was not a simple story, but a complex and deeply human saga. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to support our channel. Clicking that notification bell ensures you will not miss our next dive into history. Your support makes all of this possible, and we truly appreciate you watching. We will see you next time by the fireside.